So welcome everybody to our LaRouche Pack Saturday discussion. It is February 12th, 2022. We are going to be led in this discussion by Benjamin Deniston. Before I introduce him formally, I guess, and bring him on, I just wanted to give people a sense, certainly welcome all the new participants that are on tonight, because at this point, we are really situated in a mass strike that's occurring. I think people have a sense of what's happening with the Freedom Convoy in Canada, which is spreading. In terms of its spirit, it's certainly spreading around the world, as you see expressions in France. And we have to get it to spread in solidarity in the United States. I had the opportunity to visit the Ambassador Bridge today, and well, you can't really go over it, but you definitely saw halfway towards the international border. I saw the trucks lined up. I saw the banners on the bridge, and what's important to really notice and get the sense of is that these people are not backing down, even with threats of severe financial punishment, with their livelihoods in terms of their permits being ripped from them, their capability of actually doing business, is they're not backing down based on those threats. And that takes a massive amount of courage, and I think this can continue to spread. We were sort of strategizing with some people that also came to visit to see what was going on. There was some press down there, but we certainly want this to spread in the United States. So find your local groups, get to your local meetings, get people, give people a chance to really organize themselves to get out there and show a sense of solidarity with this movement. So, I mean, this discussion from Ben certainly comes as a part of our Bankrupt the Fed perspective and our campaign, which we launched, I would say, about a month ago. And if people go to our website, you can see that on our page, the drop-down box. You have a Bankrupt Fed. It'll take you to all of the articles that we've written up to this point. And today, is actually a very special day, because it is February 12th, and in February 12th, 2019, this is the 3rd year anniversary of Lyndon LaRouche's passing. And this would be, this is our way of paying tribute to a triumphant life. Hopefully people got the email. If not, get to our website. There is a video post from today entitled, "We Are the Fire Bringers." And it's a clip, about a 35-minute clip of a speech that Mr. LaRouche gave at a webcast in December of 2009, I believe. So certainly this is in the wake of the 2008 financial blowout. And so I think this is an extremely important and timely discussion. And what better way to pay tribute to a life well spent and a talent well spent. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Ben, and we'll open up for discussion again.
Thank you, Mihua. Sounds like you guys are having some fun there. Glad to be on with everybody today. I think if people who are joining us live, who got the invite, know that we're going to discuss some of the economic situation as Mihua outlined. I'm sure people saw the headlines. Inflation is now at a 40-year high, according to official standards. Anybody who's kind of followed this at all over the years wonders if they're officially saying it's at a 40-year high, what is it really? Because they're constantly manipulating what they're measuring, how they're measuring, and so on. And this is provoking a new round of concern, discussion about the fragility of the US economy. And so we have a lot to say on this subject. I've got a set of slides, and we're going to lay out a perspective for how to shift the discussion, at least into the right domain, where we can actually derive at some real policies, some real solutions. So I'm going to just take a second and share my slides here so we can go through a little bit what we have outlined for the discussion. So like I said, there's open discussion about inflation being a crisis. And what we've seen recently, just in the last few days, is the discussion of the Federal Reserve now holding a meeting, the Board of Governors holding a meeting on Monday, February 14th, where they're going to discuss the interest rate issue. And there's all, as you can see on the screen here, a bunch of snapshots of headlines, all this discussion. Surging inflation heightens Fed debate over how fast to raise interest rates. One is what the Wall Street Journal is saying. Bloomberg, Fed doesn't yet favor a high point hike or emergency mode. Market Watch opinion, why interest rates aren't really the right tool to control inflation. So there's just discussion across the board, right? Some people are saying we got to do this. Some people are saying we can't do it. It's not the real issue. It's not really the way to solve it. And it's just kind of, in a certain sense, a certain level of lunacy around the whole situation. There's really a lack of an understanding of the fundamentals of economy as Lyndon LaRouche understood, as many better economists used to understand. You know, the discussion of economics has become so polluted that you don't really have a basis for people to even judge or assess what policies will work, what policies won't work. Why might one policy work or not work? What are the metrics by which you judge that? What's the basis of understanding or judging? How should we respond to this? What can we do? What can't we do? Right. So that's our job, right? That's what we're doing. That's what LaRouche PAC is continuing to do. You know, and today I'm glad Niwa mentioned it. You know, in special honor of Mr. LaRouche himself, the founder of this organization, one of America's greatest patriots, passed away 3 years ago today. But although he left us physically, his ideas are alive and active and more important than ever. As we look at the severity of the situation, you know, he has laid out much of the work needed to get us out of this crisis and move us into a better future. So I really think you got to go right now with the depth of the crisis, you really got to go to these root issues. What is an economy, right? Because a lot of the assumptions and underlying ideas, underlying axioms that people have at the basis of their idea of economics or what an economy is, are really the problem. There's not a real understanding of physical economy, of economy as a physical science, which is the only way we're going to find the right solutions and move us out of this crisis. You know, and again, this is Mr. LaRouche's bread and butter, if you want to put it in those terms. This is what Mr. LaRouche provided as some unique original work, improving on the developments of people like Alexander Hamilton, other leading co-thinkers, developers of the American system of economy. And Mr. LaRouche took this unique, superior understanding of economics as a physical science even further. And if we're really going to understand how to address this crisis, we need to really understand the right basis to approach it. So you have conceptions like potential relative population density, right? That's where we should be starting the discussion. If people aren't familiar with this term, this is a measure of economic growth that Mr. LaRouche developed, right? He says, if you really want to measure the growth of an economy or decline of an economy, if you want to measure how an economy is doing as a totality, or the global economy as a totality, don't measure GDP, don't measure just monetary valuations, don't measure things like just employment rates per se. You really have to have a metric that reflects what an economy really is. Potential relative population density. If you want to put it in a little bit of a simpler term, doesn't quite grasp all the technicalities, you could call it carrying capacity. What's the carrying capacity of a territory or of the planet, if you're looking at the global economy, for the human species specifically, right? What's the ability to sustain a certain level of population at a certain living standard? And That's an idea, a concept Mr. LaRouche developed under the idea of potential relative population density. What's the potential population that can be sustained in a certain territory relative to the resources, land area of that territory, and so on. So the question is, the real idea, the real root of the issue that no one seems to talk about when they talk about economics is that human beings change that. And we're the only species that we know of, the only species on this planet for damn sure, that changes that. We don't have a fixed carrying capacity. But we do have limits at any given stage in history. You know, you couldn't have sustained the present population. You know, you couldn't sustain 7-8 billion people 500 years ago. You just couldn't do it. It wasn't because we increased the GDP or printed more money. It's something much more fundamental and deeper than that. Somehow, the human species, which is something no animals can do, was able to grow in its population from, you know, you go back thousands of years, millions of years, you know, a few millions of a global population, tens of millions of a global population, into hundreds of millions, into billions. And we can go well beyond that if we pursue the right policies. So what is it? How do we do that? That's something unique about mankind. That's a physical change in our relation to the environment, in our ability to change our own carrying capacity, change our potential relative population density. So if you want to go to the fundamentals, the real issues we need to be talking about, that's where we should be starting. What is a human economy? How are we able to do this? And how can we then understand what policies facilitate that process, will move that process forward, and which policies are detrimental, like the green policy, which are negative in those terms, which lower the potential relative population density that we need to abandon and move beyond, right? So it's a much deeper, more fundamental question than, you know, whether or not the Fed in its present form should raise or lower interest rates, or whether or not, you know, these spending bills that the Biden administration and the Congress were having all this craziness about over the last couple of years, right? All of those are just completely off the mark because they're not even starting from the right basis of discussion. They're not setting the proper terms of discussion to even really be able to address these issues. So what we want to look at is, how do we generate real economic progress? And that's how we're going to get out of this crisis, right? We are facing a physical economic crisis, a real economic crisis. But the solution is going to come from, again, increasing the potential relative population density, improving, implementing new technological revolutions that will facilitate that process, rapidly developing and implementing new technologies to improve the economy, improve the productive powers of labor, and bring us forward, create real economic growth. And it's these technologies that facilitate this growth, and it's rooted, as we're going to conclude with, rooted in science and the unique ability of mankind to discover the unseen, unsensed, unsensible principles that govern the universe, a unique human power of creativity to make hypotheses, generate ideas that are somehow coherent with and consistent with levels of organization of the universe that we can never sense directly, you can never see, you can never hear. You sense the effects, but you never, you know, we're able to hypothesize and come to interact with the universe in ways beyond the senses that express, again, this unique human creative capability, which we're then able to utilize in technologies to transform human capabilities, increase productivity, and so on. So that's where we need to start from. And in that context, what we're discussing at LaRouche PAC, what we're looking at in terms of our sense for how to respond to this crisis, what Mr. LaRouche has talked about, what he talked about in this 2009 webcast that Mihua mentioned at the beginning, which we just posted a a substantial clip from on the LaRouche PAC website. 2009, that was coming out of the 2007, 2008 housing bubble, so-called, the banking crisis around that, major economic crisis. What Mr. LaRouche laid out there is very similar to what we're talking about here. Driving real physical growth, technological growth, scientific revolutions. That's how you're going to get out of the crisis. That's how you're going to move things forward, only in those terms. So what we're looking at are, and I did some work on this recently. I just reviewed a 1983 paper by Mr. LaRouche called the NASA program, or the NASA principle, the crash program, which is a relative to some of his other writings, a relatively short piece, very fascinating piece. I suggest people find it. When we post this on the website, we can post a link to it. You can Google it and find it just by the title there and Mr. LaRouche's name in 1983. But he lays out a very fascinating and useful perspective on the history of crash programs throughout the United States, throughout Western European civilization, and how pretty much any period of major economic transformation, major economic development, progress, growth, came with some form of a crash program, an economic crash program, or economic driver program, typified, for example, by the Apollo program. That's probably the best reference point we have today for the kind of thing that we need to be talking about. Now, what I have displayed here is the cover of a report that was done in the mid-1970s, analyzing the impact of the Apollo program on the US economy. And they showed that even by the mid-1970s, for every dollar that the US government had spent on the Apollo program, the US economy in its totality generated $14 worth of new wealth, new value, specifically through the implementation of technologies, more advanced technologies, throughout the productive process, throughout the economy. So they showed that, rather very, very in direct opposition to what many haters of the space program say, this was not a waste of money. This was one of the best investments we'd ever made as a country. Because to achieve this crash program, this goal, this mission orientation program to put mankind on the moon, we had to develop vast arrays of new technologies, improve machining, improve material sciences, improve biological sciences, come up with all kinds of new production capabilities, which were needed to accomplish the objective, but which could then be applied in all kinds of other industries throughout the economy, and allowing all of those industries to become more productive, for the people employed in those industries to be able to produce more efficiently, cheaper. And so you had this massive economic growth, and it's really the last time we had a major sustained period of real economic growth rooted in some kind of competent economic program. So this becomes a key reference point for this idea of a crash program, technological driver program, science driver program, which is the kind of thing we really need today to fundamentally solve the problem we're facing in the current economy. And again, like in the 1960s with the Apollo program, and like Mr. LaRouche laid out in this 2009 address that Mihua cited in the beginning, the next crash programs, the future leaps in technology is going to be intimately connected to space exploration, space colonization, and the development of the associated technologies with a heavy emphasis on nuclear fission and fusion power. And so this is a depiction I like personally, which I think unites that perspective pretty well, which is an illustration of what it might look like to mine the surface of the moon for fusion fuel for helium-3, which is a very unique and very special form of fuel for fusion power, which is basically absent from the Earth. It's in very, very, very small quantities, but it is concentrated enough on the moon to make it economically viable to mine and sustain and be used to sustain an advanced fusion economy. And we can get into what that means a little bit, an advanced fusion economy, maybe in some of the discussion. But this idea of taking the next leaps in mankind's expansion into space, building industries on the moon, developing the resources available on the moon, both for use back here on Earth and use and further expansion into space, going to Mars, going into the deeper solar system, learning to live on these other planets, huge challenges, learning how to develop propulsion systems that can get you around the solar system, you know, an order of magnitude faster than present capabilities, which requires the energy density of nuclear systems. Nuclear fission can do some things initially, but nuclear fusion propulsion is really what's going to open up the entire solar system. These are the kind of challenges we should be tackling. And we should be exciting the young generation to accomplish these missions and inspiring the development of an entire new generation of millions of people that want to be engineers, that want to be scientists, that want to participate in this process. And in attempting even having a relatively small percentage of the population directly engaged in these programs, really driving the entire economy with that mission orientation, that spear point, again, driving technological developments, driving innovation, driving new revolutions in technology, which will be the real source of true economic growth, real economic value, which can get us out of the current crisis. And to understand that, you know, I always go back to a physical model that Mr. LaRouche developed for how a physical economy works and how to begin to have the basis to even measure and discuss what real economic value is. You know, because we kind of just discussed it in some general terms. You know, I put out a general perspective on some of these things, you know, but to really understand it, you have to set up the right framework, the right relationships, the right language to even have the right discussion. So it really starts in Mr. LaRouche's science of physical economics from your productive labor force. And you want to look at, I'm going to build this up in increasing steps of complexity, but you're starting by simply looking at what's the ability of your labor force, your productive labor force specifically, to produce the physical goods needed to sustain society. And if we go back to what I was saying about potential relative population density and mankind's ability to go from only being able to sustain a few millions of people to now billions of people, and in the future, if we continue in the right direction, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of people. The ability to do that is facilitated, requires obviously a certain level of physical production to sustain that process. We need to build and sustain our infrastructure. We need to build and maintain and advance our industries, our machinery, our tools that produce these things, right? Obviously, we need housing, we need transportation, right? We need water systems, right? So the human species' ability to have this completely unique increase in potential relative population density is mediated through, you know, this physical productive process. You can't do it without that, right? We don't evolve the way animals have evolved biologically, by going through biological evolutionary changes. We evolve technologically through creative discoveries, and we craft the machinery, the tools, the infrastructure that facilitate this new ability to interact with the universe, with the natural world, whatever you want to call it, in a more fundamental way, and sustain higher living standards, right? So you're looking at this relation ultimately between your productive labor force and their ability to produce not just physical good output, or as it's called here, final goods output, but specifically the physical goods needed to maintain your society at a given level of development, right? What do you need to maintain your infrastructure? You know, you need to replace bridges. You need to replace water systems that age. You need to replace power systems that are aging. You constantly need to be investing to maintain your society. You need to maintain your houses. You need to build new housing, build new buildings, et cetera, new cars. You know, I think you get the idea that there's a certain physical requirement to maintain society at a given level of potential relative population density. That physical good requirements is produced by a certain section of your population, certain section of your labor force, what we'll call the productive labor force specifically. Now, for them to do this, for this productive labor force to produce the physical goods needed, there's got to be certain physical goods they consume to do that. And these are physical goods they consume in their households personally. And these are also physical goods they consume in their productive, in their place of employment directly, what you call the productive process, right? So we're isolating the productive section of the labor force, and we're looking at what's the physical goods inputs they need to sustain their households, to sustain them as families, as part of the population, and to sustain their work, right? If they work at a factory, what physical goods keep that factory up and running, right? Or what physical goods keep the infrastructure going that powers that factory, that supplies energy to that factory, and so on, right? So again, we're building up in steps of complexity a real model of how an economy actually operates. Then we can take this further, expanding to looking at what supports not only the productive section of the population, but the total population. What in the terminology Mr. LaRouche used in developing this model, the overhead households, the households employed in overhead activity, overhead meaning just not directly engaged in the physical productive process itself. And some overhead is necessary and good. Some overhead is what you would call waste. You know, there's details we can get into on that. But again, and the overhead section of the population also requires a certain level of physical good input to keep them going, right? To house your teachers, house your medical workers, keep the hospitals up and running, keep the schools up and running, and so on, right? So there's a certain level of physical input required to sustain the overhead section of the population and their activities. And the point of this is that once you have that level of rigorous breakdown, then you can actually assess, well, we know what's needed to maintain the economy at the current level of technology, at the current level of potential relative population density, really. We know the inputs required to do that for the productive process directly, for the productive households, for the overhead households. And a fundamental measure of how well your economy is doing is then how much excess additional product is able to be produced after accounting for what's needed to sustain the economy at the current level of potential relative population density. What here we can call net operating profit, right? So you account for what's needed to maintain the economy at a certain level, and then you look at what is generated on top of that. And now we have, at least in broad strokes, kind of a completed cycle to analyze. An economy, a full cycle of a real physical economic process. You have an initial round of physical goods input, right? what's required to sustain the population, what's required to sustain the productive process, and a certain level of free energy available from the last cycle of production. And then as a product of the productive labor force of the productive process, again, the people specifically engaged in producing the physical goods that sustain society, you have the output, you have their production. And again, what they produce can then be broken down into how much is needed to sustain the economy on the next cycle. Again, sustain it just at the present level versus what's available for investment in new areas, investment in developing new technology and new exploration, free energy, stuff available to expand, stuff available to bring into new levels, right? So it's this basis, what Mr. LaRouche developed as a kind of a thermodynamic analogy of an economy that lets you really assess, well, what technologies what investments are actually working? Where are we actually seeing, people talk about technology, right? Like today, people talk about solar panel technology and green technology. And, again, I cringe bringing this up because I actually wasted a lot of time reading Biden's infrastructure bill and, analyses of those bills and all this stuff. And, people throw out all these claims about, this many green jobs are going to be created and we're going to have this green revolution and these new technologies. But if the effect of that is lowering the ability to generate additional free energy cycle after cycle in the economy, that's not good. And because it's never discussed in these terms, in the terms we're trying to develop here and get people to understand here right now, you can't even really have a discussion. You can't really assess it. Someone says, we're going to create this many jobs or we're going to create that many jobs. Are those jobs going to help the economy? Are they going to increase the productivity of the economy as a whole? Or are they jobs that's, creating a net drain, a net negative effect on the economy, right? So here, in what Mr. LaRouche developed here, at least gives you the basis to begin to have that discussion as a real scientific discussion, right? Not a lot of the hocus pocus, monetary theory, crazy stuff you get today when people talk about economics. But at least here we have the basis to begin to have the discussion, to begin to at least be able to assess and investigate whether policies are working or not working from these terms, right? This is an example, this next slide is an example of a negentropic or what a positive economic program looks like in these terms. You have one cycle of physical good inputs. Those goods are used to sustain the economy, but specifically, we're looking at how those goods are used. Those capital goods are used by the productive labor force in the productive process. And as a consequence of what they're able to produce using those inputs, at the next cycle, the utilization of what gets produced in that process, you actually have a higher ratio, a higher percentage of the total output available as free energy, again, for expansion and other uses, versus an entropic, a decaying, an unwinding, a dying economy, where cycle over cycle, you have less and less free energy available, right? So in physical terms, and this is stuff, we've covered in more specific case studies and other discussions, but this is what's been happening in the economy. This is what the green policy does. You're lowering the free energy production, lowering the ability to sustain the population, lowering the capabilities of the productive labor force through years and decades of bad economic policies. And obviously things get more complicated when you bring in, globalization and international trade, and how much of the goods we're getting now is stuff we're essentially, getting in, I don't know if you want to call it looting or ways that are not, not fair to the global economy as a totality. So, you could extend this analysis to the global economy as a whole. to really, you would have to do that to really understand the US in that context, given the complexity of the international situation now. But on a whole, this has been the root cause of the current crisis. Not where interest rates have been per se, not how many jobs have been created, not how big the spending bills have been. Again, if you're not discussing any of those things in terminology rooted in this physical assessment, you have no basis to know what's going to work or not going to work. And this is something Mr. LaRouche discussed many, many times extensively. This is a good quote from a 1984 paper he wrote called the LaRouche Doctrine, which was actually a proposal, a memorandum for how to bring the Cold War to a peaceful conclusion, which is something he was intimately involved in the late 70s into the early mid 80s. But he said in this 1984 paper, advances in technology are transmitted into the productive process as a whole through the incorporation of improved technologies in capital goods. Most emphatically, capital goods of the machine tool or analogous classification. Therefore, the only means by which a national economy can sustain significant rates of technological progress is by placing emphasis upon the capital goods sector of production and maintaining sufficiently high rates of turnover in that sector to foster high rates of technological innovation in the goods produced. So to go back to our framework here, when Mr. LaRouche is mentioning capital goods here, he's talking about the physical goods input going into and sustaining the productive process directly. So that becomes a central point in maintaining and generating real economic growth and sustaining real economic growth, and why things like a crash program, science driver crash programs, are critical, and why that's the kind of program we need to get out of the current crisis today. If we want to look at this a little more specifically again in this framework, here we have isolated the capital goods, as Mr. LaRouche discussed there, out of the physical good inputs, and highlighted the capital goods going into the productive process. And if we look at this question Mr. LaRouche raised, if you're investing a certain technological advance in the capital goods that are going into the productive process, we see a fascinating change when you go to the next cycle of production in the economy, where the capital good, the physical inputs needed to sustain the production of the same level of output actually diminishes cycle to cycle as a function of higher technologies employed in the productive process directly. Or to put it in Mr. LaRouche's terms, as he discussed it in his economics textbook, he says, what if the capital goods produced represent a higher level of technology or economy of labor in their application than the level of technology employed to produce them? In here, this precise location lies the secret of the paradox and the substance of neg entropy in the economic process. So again, what if the capital goods produced represent a higher level of technology as expressed in the economy of labor in their application than the level of technology employed to produce them? So this is the secret of negentropic growth, of economic growth, again, which can only be even expressed or discussed or understood if you put it in this type of framework. But it's the ability to employ new technologies, which in the capital goods sector most critically, which allow your productive labor force to produce higher levels of output, higher quality of output, cycle after cycle. And Mr. LaRouche always argued for high rates of turnover in the productive sector, in the capital goods employed in the productive sector, So you're constantly bringing in new technologies. So your productive labor force is constantly getting new machine tools, new machinery, new tools that operate, each of which includes new technologies, has new innovations included in it, which increases the productivity of those operatives, right? That's the kind of process that is going to create real economic value, real economic growth, and sustain it. And that's the secret to things like crash programs like we saw with Apollo. Again, this $14 to $1 payback for the Apollo program. That for every dollar we spent going to the moon, you know, that money was spent here on Earth, and it was spent on developing new materials, new material sciences, new abilities to produce new materials, new tolerances in the productive process, right? Medical sciences, on and on, right? I'm sure people are familiar with some of this. That all the investments we made and all the money we spent and all the people we employed, you know, developed vast arrays of new technologies, new capabilities, which didn't just stay in the space sector, didn't just stay there. They were spread and made available throughout the economy to be employed throughout the economy, and drive new levels of productivity in many sectors. You know, and there were other things that the Kennedy administration was trying to do to facilitate and accelerate this process to help ensure that people had credit available specifically for new capital goods investments, and facilitating this kind of technological turnover. But this is just one stat that I find fascinating in this context, that if you look at the capital goods, the new capital goods, the capital goods turnover basically from the 1950s to the 1960s. So again, throughout this, into this Apollo program, crash program era, the non-aerospace sectors of the economy that were not directly engaged in any way in anything relating to the space program, sectors of the economy that were not, directly producing materials for the rockets to be able to, get off the Earth. There's people that were not directly producing, navigation systems, guidance systems for the spacecraft as they were traveling from the Earth to the moon, right? People that were companies that were not sectors of the economy, companies that were not directly engaged in the aerospace, moon program, crash program endeavor, or even aerospace or defense more generally, still employed, went through a rapid rate of turnover in their acquiring new capital goods, which new machine tools, new machinery, et cetera, which had now employed and had available technologies that were developed by the space program, right? So again, you see this sense of how a crash program can not just accomplish an amazing feat like that, and not just inspire an entire country and a world, which it did, which is not, I'm not saying that's insignificant, but also has real tangible effects on driving the economy forward in its totality. So again, that's the kind of thing we need to be looking at today, right? Not that getting to the moon next year is going to solve our crisis, right? But endeavoring to turn the US economy around and turn it again into a productive, technologically advanced powerhouse on the planet, and adopting the missions and the challenges that will require us to do that is going to be the program that is necessary to get us out of this crisis. Nothing else is going to work unless it can accomplish a return to a technologically progressive, highly productive manufacturing and industrial powerhouse again in the economy. So we looked at things like the moon. We looked to new technologies to increase our ability to access space, continue the kind of things that Elon Musk has done with SpaceX, dramatically lowering the cost of putting payload and people up into Earth orbit, making space far more accessible, opening up the what certain visionaries used to talk about as the interplanetary economy in a real sense. Again, nuclear power is going to be critical, advanced fission technologies, fusion technologies, power our stations on the moon, power our satellite systems, power our transportation, the ability to get people safely, quickly, and efficiently from the Earth to the moon, from the Earth system to Mars, right? Be able to get around. You're going to need major breakthroughs in these areas. We're going to need a highly advanced, developing nuclear industry, both fission and fusion. And beginning, and developing entire new capabilities to develop resources in space environments, right? Again, here we see depicted the idea how mining helium-3 from the moon might look like, but mining other other gases, we need oxygen, right? Hydrogen, getting water resources, metals, being able to begin to construct materials from asteroids, from the lunar surface, from the resources available to us in space. These are all necessary advances to really accomplish these goals of the next levels of space exploration, space colonization. And all of these things, right? Advanced Earth launch systems, space propulsion systems, completely new era capabilities in the areas of nuclear power, resource utilization, resource development, manufacturing in space and other planetary bodies, right? The technological spin-offs, benefits will be immense, right? This is what will drive the next, generations of advance, of progress, of increase of potential relative population density on the Earth, right? This is the kind of program we need. And I want to conclude with just kind of rounding it off a little bit with a quote that I found rather provocative from this 1983 paper I mentioned at the beginning, the NASA Principle, the Crash Program by Mr. LaRouche. Again, relatively short, 8-9 pages, but it's just a fascinating history of crash programs and their importance and their prevalence throughout the history of the United States, throughout Europe, certain periods in European development, and how every era of major progress, major development shared these similar characteristics. And he highlighted the Apollo program. He talked about the Manhattan Project significantly as well, talked about projects under Washington, under Lincoln. The Apollo project is something we're focusing on here, kind of a pinnacle. But I was fascinated to see that he said that the greatest crash program ever, now just going straight to the quote from him, the greatest crash program ever launched was that associated with the work of Lazare Carnot and Gaspard Monge over the period of 1793 to 1815. And this is in France. So after the French Revolution in France. He says, although the echoes of this École Polytechnique program are found in the Manhattan Project and NASA research and the NASA research and development effort, and to a significant degree in the work at the Peenemünde under Professor Adolf Busemann in the Göttingen tradition. These 20th century cases lack the stress upon the fundamental breakthroughs in education required in the work of the Carnot-Monge École Polytechnique. So this is, a little snippet. He goes on to elaborate in more detail. I just found it fascinating that he said, this is the greatest example of a crash program, some history I'm not all that familiar with. I'm a little bit familiar with, but I'm sure many people are not at all familiar with. But led to not only a great explosion of increases in machine tool capabilities and machining and technology at the time, but also a whole wave of fundamental advances in science. And he stresses in this discussion that the superiority of this particular crash program, this particular historical precedent, which again, he says was actually more successful in a certain sense, and greater than even the Apollo program. Not in the specter of its accomplishment in terms of what it did as the goal of that crash program, but the overall impact on the population and on the people at that time was this was this period in France, and it was rooted in their emphasis on the fundamentals of science and discovery, as well as technology per se. It wasn't just the attempt to rapidly implement and engineer more advanced technologies based on our current understandings of science, but to challenge our current understanding of science, challenge our current levels of the deepest conceptions of how the universe operates and works, and try to push those forward, push those to new levels, right? And that really is the root of economic progress, because that is the root of the distinction of mankind from the animals. You know, like we said at the beginning, the ability to hypothesize valid ideas about how the universe operates without ever sensing them, tasting them, smelling them, experiencing them directly. There's something in the human mind that's unique, a power of creativity, as Mr. LaRouche would always often call it, that allows mankind to come up with conceptions, ideas, discoveries that are coherent with the fundamental laws or principles of the organization of the universe. And once we have those ideas, those discoveries, those new insights, we can then create technologies based on them. We can create machinery, we can create infrastructure, we can create, you know, again, technologies that are built upon, derived from these fundamental scientific notions, right? Certain fundamental ideas about electromagnetism and electricity, right? How many technologies are built upon that, right? You know, certain fundamental ideas about chemistry, how much of material science, you know, and developments in chemistry are based on those fundamental notions going back to, you know, Mendeleev, the periodic table and development of chemistry, right? The nuclear era, right? Einstein, the people around him, other people, Curie, you know, the people that contributed to a complete revolution in our understanding the most basic organization and fundamental building blocks of matter and the relation of matter and energy, right? Those fundamental discoveries completely transformed understanding of the universe, how things are built, how things operate, leading to the potential for, you know, an entire array of technologies, nuclear technologies, fission, fusion, power generation, materials processing, and so on, based upon those new fundamental discoveries, fundamental ideas, right? So that should be our basis for approaching this today, right? I think anybody would be absurd if they think we're fundamentally done in scientific endeavors and we basically understand how the universe operates, right? That's been said famously many times before, often not too long before great revolutionary discoveries were made, completely upending our fundamental notions of how the universe operates. You know, if we just look to the excitement around the James Webb Space Telescope, you know, NASA's success, you know, it's getting closer to actually being able to start to do observations. You know, who knows what that's going to bring up in terms of new anomalies, new questions about the way the universe is organized, and new ideas needed to resolve those anomalies, those questions. So, you know, to have a fully successful crash program that we need today, you know, we need to inspire and excite future generations about looking to address, to meet these challenges, but also to understand and pursue their creative abilities as trying to unlock the secrets of the universe. You know, the next unknown, unseen questions that are going to be posed to them as we move forward. So that's, you know, if not a direct A, B, C, D set of solutions to the current crisis, that's at least the framework, the valid basis to be able to even begin to address what we're doing now, what we're going to do now to solve this, you know, challenge that we're facing. So I will stop there. Hopefully that's provocative enough to start some fun discussion. I look forward to what people have to say. So I'll leave it there and see what we got.